The blood-stained pages felt warm against Marcus Thompson's trembling fingers, even though the basement was freezing. December 23, 2025. Just 8 days before the date that would change everything. The history book's leather cover bore no publisher's mark, no copyright date, yet the title page clearly read, "A Complete History of the 21st Century Revised Edition 2087. What made his stomach churn wasn't the impossible publication date, but the sticky red handprints smeared across Chapter 47. The event of January 1st, 2026. When humanity's clock stopped. The words seemed to writhe on the page like living things describing horrors that hadn't happened yet. Or had they? Marcus could hear something scratching inside the walls of his grandmother's basement. Something that sounded almost like fingernails against wood. The book had been waiting for him in the exact spot where his grandmother used to hide her most precious possessions, as if it knew he would come looking after her funeral. But it was the photograph tucked between pages 847 and 848 that made him drop the book entirely. A newspaper clipping dated January 2, 2026, showing his own face under the headline, "Local Librarian Found Dead After Attempting to Warn the Public." The man in the photo looked exactly like him, down to the small scar above his left eyebrow, except his eyes held a terror that Marcus had never experienced. Yet. Welcome back to my channel, fellow horror enthusiasts. You're about to hear something that will make you question everything you think you know about time itself. Where are you watching this from? Because depending on your answer, you might want to start paying very close attention to what happens around you in the next few days. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more true horror stories, and please, share this with everyone you know. Time might be running out faster than we think. Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of person who found comfort in predictable routines. At 34, he was the head librarian at Millbrook Public Library, a position that suited his methodical nature perfectly. Every morning at 7:15 a.m., he would unlock the heavy oak doors, breathe in the familiar scent of aged paper and binding glue, and begin his day by organizing the returned books that waited for him like old friends. The small New England town of Millbrook had been his home for his entire life, population 3847, according to the faded welcome sign on Route 9. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the biggest excitement usually came from the annual pumpkin festival or when old Mrs. Henley's cat got stuck in the fire station's bell tower again. Marcus lived alone in his grandmother's Victorian house on Elm Street, the same house where he'd spent every summer of his childhood listening to her stories about the old days and learning to love books the way other children loved video games. His grandmother, Eleanor Thompson, had been the town's unofficial historian before her death 3 weeks ago. She'd collected everything: newspapers, photographs, personal letters, even restaurant menus from the 1950s. Her basement was a carefully organized archive that Marcus had been slowly sorting through since the funeral. Most neighbors thought Eleanor was just a sweet old lady with a hoarding problem, but Marcus knew better. She had an almost supernatural ability to sense when something important was about to happen in Millbrook. She'd warned people to stay indoors the night before the flash flood of 2018 and somehow knew to stock up on supplies 3 days before the unexpected blizzard of 2021. The basement itself was a maze of filing cabinets, storage boxes, and shelves lined with books, journals, and newspapers dating back to the 1800s. Eleanor had installed a complex cataloging system that would make any librarian proud. Every item had a location code, a date, and a brief description written in her careful handwriting. But there was one corner of the basement that she'd always kept locked, a small room behind a heavy wooden door that she'd forbidden Marcus from entering even as an adult. The key to that room had been hidden in her jewelry box, along with a note written in Eleanor's shaky handwriting. For Marcus, when you're ready to understand why our family has always been the Watchers, the burden passes to you now. Be careful what you choose to do with what you find. Love, Grandma. The note was dated just 2 days before her unexpected heart attack, as if she somehow knew her time was running out. Marcus had been putting off opening that room for weeks, telling himself he was too busy with funeral arrangements and settling her estate. But the truth was that something about the locked door made him deeply uncomfortable. Even as a child, he'd noticed that the house felt different near that corner of the basement. Colder somehow and filled with an electrical tension that made the hair on his arms stand up. It wasn't until yesterday, December 22nd, that he'd finally worked up the courage to turn that old brass key in the lock. The locked room was smaller than Marcus had expected, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with no windows and walls lined from floor to ceiling with books. But these weren't the familiar volumes he'd grown up seeing throughout the rest of the house. These books looked wrong somehow. Their spines bore familiar titles like World War II, A Complete History, or The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. But when he pulled them from the shelves, the publication dates made no sense. A book about the American Civil War, published in 1847, 14 years before the war even began. A detailed account of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, printed in 1898. At first, Marcus assumed they were just elaborate reproductions, or maybe his grandmother's idea of a historical fiction collection. But as he examined them more closely, he realized these weren't reprints or novels. They contained photographs, personal accounts, and specific details that no fiction writer could have imagined. The book about World War II included pictures of battles from angles that suggested the photographer had been standing in impossible positions, and quoted conversations between historical figures that had never been recorded by any official source. His hands were shaking as he worked his way deeper into the collection. Books about the Kennedy assassination that included details never released to the public. An account of the Challenger disaster that described the exact words spoken in NASA's control room during those final moments. Each book seemed to know things that shouldn't have been knowable, at least not when they were supposedly published. And then he found it tucked away on the bottom shelf in the very back corner, a thick volume bound in dark leather that seemed to absorb the light from his flashlight rather than reflect it. The cover was completely plain, except for a title embossed in what looked like silver thread. A Complete History of the 21st Century, Revised Edition, 2087. Marcus pulled the book from the shelf and immediately noticed its weight. It felt far heavier than it should have based on its size, as if the pages themselves were made of something denser than paper. When he opened it to the first page, his flashlight beam seemed to dim, and for a moment he could have sworn he heard something like whispers coming from between the pages. The copyright page listed no publisher, no ISBN, no Library of Congress number, just a single line, compiled by the archive keepers for the preservation of all that was lost. Below that, in smaller text, warning: knowledge of future events may cause temporal displacement. Read at your own risk. Marcus almost laughed at what seemed like an elaborate practical joke until he flipped to a random page and found himself reading about Hurricane Patricia, the devastating storm that had hit the Gulf Coast just 2 months ago, in October 2025. The account was written with the detached tone of a historian looking back at events from decades in the past, complete with casualty figures that exactly matched the official reports and quotes from news conferences that Marcus remembered watching on television. But this book claimed to have been written in 2087, 62 years from now. How could it contain perfect details about something that had just happened? With growing unease, he flipped through more pages. There were chapters on events he recognized from recent years, all written in the same historical tone. The economic recession of 2023, the breakthrough in fusion energy from early 2024, even the strange weather patterns that had been making headlines throughout 2025. Everything was accurate down to the smallest details. Marcus found himself turning pages faster and faster, looking for the current date. Chapter 45 covered the summer of 2025. Chapter 46 detailed the autumn and early winter, including a brief mention of the death of Eleanor Thompson, the last of the Watchers in Millbrook, on December 1st, 2025. The exact date of his grandmother's heart attack. His hands were trembling as he turned to Chapter 47, titled, The Event of January 1st, 2026, When Humanity's Clock Stopped. The chapter began with a simple sentence that made Marcus's blood run cold. At exactly 11:43 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on December 31st, 2025, the first signs became visible to those who knew how to look. That was just 8 days away. He read the opening paragraph 3 times, each time feeling more nauseated. The phenomenon that would later be known as the event began as most world-ending catastrophes do, quietly. In small towns across the globe, those with the genetic markers necessary for temporal perception began to experience what doctors initially misdiagnosed as mass hallucinations. They reported seeing shadows that moved independently of their owners, hearing voices that seemed to come from empty rooms, and feeling the presence of people who shouldn't exist. In Millbrook, Massachusetts, the local librarian Marcus Thompson first encountered evidence of the coming catastrophe when he discovered his grandmother's collection of future histories on December 23, 2025. Despite clear warnings, Thompson chose to continue reading, thus ensuring his own participation in the events he was trying to prevent. Marcus dropped the book and stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The book landed open to a page filled with photographs, black and white images that showed streets he recognized. Main Street in Millbrook, the library where he worked his own house, but wrong somehow. The shadows in the photographs fell in impossible directions, and there were people in the pictures who seemed to be looking directly at the camera with expressions of absolute terror. But it was the last photograph that made him run for the stairs. A picture of himself sitting in this very basement, holding this very book with a timestamp that read December 23, 2025, 9:47 p.m. According to his watch, it was currently 9:46 p.m. As he reached for the light switch, the bulb flickered once and went out, leaving him in complete darkness. In the silence, he could hear something that sounded like pages turning, even though he was certain he'd left the book on the floor. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He'd made it upstairs and locked the basement door behind him, but every time he closed his eyes, he could hear what sounded like whispers coming from below. At 3 a.m., he'd finally given up on sleep and made coffee, sitting at his kitchen table and staring at the basement door while trying to convince himself that stress and grief were playing tricks on his mind. But when morning came, he found himself drawn back downstairs like a moth to flame. The book was exactly where he'd dropped it, still open to the photographs. In daylight, streaming through the high basement windows, everything seemed less sinister. The pictures looked old and faded, probably doctored somehow. The whole thing had to be an elaborate hoax, maybe something his grandmother had commissioned as a family prank before she died. That rational explanation lasted exactly until he read the next paragraph. Thompson returned to the basement at 7:23 a.m. on December 24th, despite his fear. This behavior pattern, observed in 847 similar cases across the globe, appears to be part of the temporal lock mechanism. Those who discover evidence of the event become compulsively drawn to learn more, even when they understand the knowledge will destroy them. Marcus checked his phone. It was 7:23 a.m. With hands that seemed to move independently of his will, he began turning pages. Chapter 47 was longer than the others, nearly 100 pages of detailed accounts, timeline analyses, and what appeared to be scientific reports written in a jargon he didn't understand. But scattered throughout were passages that felt personal, almost like diary entries. Day 1, December 31st, 2025. The first displacement events begin. Reality becomes fluid near locations with high temporal energy concentrations. Witnesses report seeing people who died years ago walking the streets, having conversations with family members who insist the conversations never happened. Day 3, January 2nd, 2026. Communication networks fail globally as the electromagnetic fields generated by temporal fractures interfere with all electronic equipment. The last confirmed transmission was a distress call from Antarctic Research Station Alpha 7 reporting that their instruments were detecting impossible readings and that some of their crew members had become unstuck in time. Day 7, January 7th, 2026, the boundaries between past and present collapse entirely in affected zones. Survivors describe seeing historical events play out in real time. Civil War battles in empty fields, extinct animals wandering modern streets, deceased relatives continuing their daily routines as if they had never died. Day 12, January 12th, 2026, the final wave reaches 100% global saturation. Time loses all meaning. Past, present, and future exist simultaneously in all locations. The last coherent historical record was this account compiled by Archive Keeper designation TK451 at exactly 11:43 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 12, 2026, before voluntary termination to prevent further temporal contamination. Marcus realized he'd been reading for hours when his phone rang, startling him so badly that he knocked over his coffee mug. The caller ID showed his colleague Janet from the library. "Marcus? Thank God you answered. Are you okay? You didn't show up for work and you never miss work. Some of us were worried you might be having a breakdown after your grandmother's funeral." He looked at his phone again. It was 2:30 p.m. He'd been reading for over 7 hours, though it had felt like minutes. I'm fine, Janet. Just dealing with some things I found in my grandmother's papers. I'll be in tomorrow." "Are you sure you're okay? You sound really strange." Marcus almost told her everything. About the book, the impossible publication date, the photographs that seemed to predict his own actions. But as he opened his mouth to speak, he found himself reading another passage that made the words die in his throat. Thompson's first attempt to warn others occurred on December 24th at 2:31 p.m. when he contacted his colleague Janet Morrison. However, the temporal lock mechanism prevented him from conveying meaningful information about the threat. All attempts to share knowledge of the event with those who had not been directly exposed to future historical documents resulted in the information being perceived as delusional ravings. Marcus, are you there?" "I'm here," he managed. "I'll see you tomorrow." He hung up and immediately tried calling his best friend Mike, then his sister Sarah in California. Each time he found himself unable to explain what he discovered. The words would come out wrong, or his phone would cut out at crucial moments, or the person he was talking to would suddenly remember an urgent appointment and have to go. It was as if some invisible force was preventing him from communicating the information. By evening, Marcus had read through most of Chapter 47, and what he learned made him seriously consider burning the entire book. According to the account, the event wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was triggered by people like him, people who found these books and became obsessed with reading them. Each person who learned about the future somehow weakened the barriers between timelines until eventually the whole structure collapsed. But even knowing this, he couldn't stop reading. Every time he tried to close the book and walk away, he'd find himself thinking about some detail he hadn't quite understood. Some question the text had raised, but not answered. The book seemed to anticipate his thoughts, because whenever he returned to it, he'd find exactly the passage that addressed his latest concern. As midnight approached on December 24th, Marcus discovered the most disturbing section yet, a detailed map of displacement zones that would appear around the globe in the week leading up to the event. According to the map, Millbrook was designated as Ground Zero Alpha, the first location where reality would begin to break down. The process would start with minor temporal echoes, glimpses of past events bleeding through into the present. Then, displacement entities. People and objects from different time periods appearing where they shouldn't exist. Finally, complete temporal collapse, where all of history would occur simultaneously. The first displacement was scheduled to begin at 11:43 p.m. on December 24th, in 18 minutes. Marcus set the book down and walked upstairs to pour himself a drink. This was insane. He was clearly having some kind of grief-induced psychotic break, possibly triggered by the stress of losing his grandmother and dealing with her estate. Books from the future didn't exist. Time travel was science fiction. He was going to have a glass of bourbon, go to bed, and in the morning, he was going to pack up all of his grandmother's belongings and donate them to charity. At exactly 11:43 p.m., Marcus heard his grandmother's voice calling his name from the basement. He froze with the bourbon halfway to his lips. Eleanor Thompson's voice, as clear as if she were standing right next to him, calling up from downstairs. "Marcus, honey, could you come help me with something down here?" But his grandmother had been dead for 3 weeks. He'd watched them lower her casket into the ground himself. "Marcus, I found something I think you need to see." Against every instinct screaming in his head to run, Marcus set down his glass and walked toward the basement door. As his hand touched the doorknob, he heard another voice join his grandmother's. A man's voice that sounded exactly like his own, but older, somehow more tired. "Don't go down there," the voice said. "Please, I'm begging you, don't make the same mistake I did." Marcus opened the basement door and saw 2 figures standing at the bottom of the stairs, clearly visible, despite the fact that all the lights were off. His grandmother looked exactly as she had the day she died, wearing her favorite blue sweater and the pearl necklace his grandfather had given her for their 50th anniversary. Standing next to her was a man who looked like Marcus himself, but aged by decades and bearing scars that Marcus didn't remember getting. "Hello, sweetheart. Eleanor said, smiling up at him with the same warm expression he remembered from childhood. "I've been waiting for you. It's time you learned the truth about our family." Marcus descended the stairs on trembling legs, his rational mind screaming that this couldn't be happening, while his heart recognized his grandmother's familiar presence as completely real. The basement felt different now, larger somehow, as if the walls had expanded beyond their normal boundaries. The air hummed with an energy that made his teeth ache, and he could see other figures moving in the shadows beyond where Eleanor and the older version of himself stood waiting. "Grandma?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. "But you died. I was at your funeral." Eleanor's expression was infinitely sad. "Oh, honey, death isn't the ending you think it is. Not for our family. We've been the Watchers for 7 generations, keeping track of the places where time gets thin. And now it's happening again, just like it did in 1847 and 1923 and 1989. Every 63 years, the barriers weaken enough for people to slip through." The older Marcus stepped forward, and Marcus could see that his aged doppelganger's eyes held a profound exhaustion. "I tried to stop it," the older version said. "I tried so hard. I burned the book I left town. I even tried to kill myself to prevent this from happening. But you can't change something that's already part of your own timeline. Every action I took to prevent the event was exactly what caused it to happen." "I don't understand," Marcus said, though part of him was beginning to, and that understanding terrified him more than anything else that had happened. Eleanor moved closer, and Marcus could smell her familiar perfume, the same lavender scent she'd worn for as long as he could remember. "The books aren't from the future, sweetheart. They're from previous cycles. Every time the event happens, reality gets reset, but not perfectly. Some things bleed through. Some people remember, and we've been tasked with keeping records documenting what happens so that maybe eventually someone will figure out how to break the cycle." She gestured toward the shadows, and Marcus saw them more clearly now. Dozens of figures, all of them wearing faces he recognized as variations of his own and Eleanor's. Men and women of different ages wearing clothing from different time periods, all bearing the same expression of resigned sorrow. "This is everyone who's tried to stop it," Eleanor explained. "Your great-great-grandfather Theodore, who first discovered the pattern in 1847. Your great-aunt Margaret, who thought she could prevent it by destroying all the documentation in 1923. Your cousin David, who tried to warn the government in 1989. All of us from every cycle trapped in this moment, because we learned too much." The older Marcus laughed bitterly. "Do you want to know the really sick joke? The book you found, the one that started all this, I wrote it. Or rather, I will write it after I watch everyone I care about disappear. I'll spend the next 63 years documenting everything that happens, compiling all the information into one comprehensive account. And then I'll hide it in this basement for my younger self to find. Because that's what the pattern demands." Marcus felt the last of his sanity crumbling. "So this is all predetermined. There's no way to change it." "Oh, you can try," said a voice from deeper in the shadows. A woman emerged wearing a 1920s dress. Great-aunt Margaret, Marcus realized with growing horror. "I managed to delay it by 6 months in my cycle by burning every piece of documentation I could find. But the information just regenerated somehow. New books appeared, new records materialized. The event has to happen exactly as documented, or reality itself starts to unravel." Eleanor's face was kind but firm. "The choice you have, Marcus, is whether you want to fight it and make everything worse, or accept your role and help minimize the damage. You can't save everyone. That's impossible. But you can choose who survives to remember." "Remember what?" Marcus asked, though he was afraid he already knew. "That this isn't the first time," the older Marcus said. "And it won't be the last. Every cycle, most people get erased completely, like they never existed. But a few, a very few, get to carry forward into the next version of reality. They become the seeds of the new world, the starting point for the next attempt." Eleanor took his hand, and her touch was warm and real and absolutely terrifying. "The event is going to happen, Marcus. In exactly 7 days, at 11:43 p.m. on December 31st, reality is going to collapse and rebuild itself. But you get to choose the survivors. You get to decide which version of history gets preserved and which gets forgotten." Marcus looked around at all the faces in the shadows. Generations of his family who had stood in this same place, making this same impossible choice. And if I refuse, the older Marcus answered, then the reset happens anyway, but randomly. Entire civilizations disappear. Important discoveries get lost. Good people die while monsters survive. At least this way you can try to preserve the best parts. Eleanor squeezed his hand. It's not a punishment, sweetheart. It's a responsibility. Our family has been shepherding humanity through these resets for centuries, trying to guide each new cycle towards something better than the last. But why? Marcus asked desperately. What causes this to happen? What's the point of all this? The basement fell silent except for the humming energy in the air. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice heavy with centuries of accumulated sorrow. Because someone has to remember Marcus. Someone has to witness. Someone has to choose what's worth saving when everything else turns to dust. As she spoke, Marcus felt something shift in his understanding, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. He could suddenly see the pattern underlying everything. The way reality bent and flexed around certain focal points. The mathematical precision with which time folded back on itself, the terrible necessity of it all. The book upstairs wasn't just a record of what would happen. It was a tool, a guide for navigating the collapse and reconstruction of everything that had ever existed, and he was the only one who could use it. Marcus looked around at his family, at all the versions of himself who had made this choice before him, and finally understood that there had never really been a choice at all. The moment he'd opened that book, the moment he'd read the first page, he had already decided. "What do I have to do?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she looked genuinely proud. "You have to choose carefully, and you have to choose soon. You have 7 days to read everything to understand the full scope of what's coming and to make your selections. And then when the moment comes, you have to let go of everything else." As the figures began to fade back into shadow, the older Marcus called out one last warning. "Remember, you can save the world, but you can't save yourself. That's the price we pay for being the Watchers." Marcus found himself alone in the basement, standing next to the open book that now seemed to pulse with its own inner light. 7 days to read the entire history of human civilization. 7 days to decide who lived and who disappeared forever. 7 days to become God. Marcus spent the next 3 days reading without sleep. The book seemed to expand as he progressed through it, growing thicker each time he turned a page, revealing new chapters and appendices that detailed every possible contingency for the coming reset. By December 27th, he understood the full scope of what was expected of him. He would need to make 3 types of selections. Preserve people and events that would carry forward unchanged. Modify historical elements that could be improved in the new timeline, and erase mistakes and tragedies that humanity shouldn't have to repeat. The book provided detailed instructions on how to encode these choices into the temporal matrix, along with warnings about the consequences of each decision. Preserving too much would create an unstable timeline that would collapse again within decades. Erasing too much would leave humanity without the lessons needed to avoid old mistakes. Every choice created ripples that would affect the entire course of future history. Marcus found himself making impossible decisions. Should he preserve the Holocaust as a historical lesson or erase it to spare millions of lives? If he erased it, would humanity learn to recognize and prevent genocide? Or would they simply repeat it in a different form? Should he preserve the atomic bomb as a deterrent to global war or erase nuclear weapons entirely and risk conventional conflicts becoming even more devastating? The book offered guidance showing him the results of different choices from previous cycles, but ultimately, the decisions were his alone. He began to understand why the older version of himself had looked so exhausted. Every choice carried the weight of entire civilizations. On December 28th, Marcus tried one last time to maintain his normal routine. He went to work at the library, helped patrons find books, processed new arrivals. But everything felt hollow and meaningless. How could he care about overdue fines and reading recommendations when he knew that in 3 days most of these people would simply cease to exist? Janet noticed his distraction. "You've been really off since you started going through your grandmother's things. Maybe you should take some time off, see a counselor or something." Marcus looked at her. Kind, hard-working Janet, who had never hurt anyone who donated to animal shelters and volunteered at the food bank, and made his first preservation decision. Janet Morrison would survive the reset. She would wake up on January 1st, 2026 in a world that was similar to this one, but subtly different, carrying forward the memory of goodness that might help the new timeline avoid some of humanity's worst impulses. That evening, Marcus called his sister Sarah in California. She was complaining about her job, her boyfriend, her financial troubles, the normal minutiae of a life that would end in 72 hours unless he chose to save it. "Marcus, are you listening to me? You're being really weird." He made his second preservation decision. By December 30th, Marcus had completed his primary selections. 7 billion people reduced to approximately 200,000 survivors scattered across the globe, each chosen for specific qualities that would help guide the new timeline toward a better outcome. Scientists, artists, teachers, caregivers, people whose contributions could help humanity avoid its worst mistakes while still learning from its greatest achievements. The hardest part was choosing which children to save. The book explained that younger survivors adapted better to reality changes, but selecting children meant choosing their families as well, and family dynamics could carry forward problematic patterns. Marcus spent 18 hours agonizing over a list of 12-year-olds from around the world before finally accepting that any choice was better than random chance. As the final day arrived, Marcus felt a strange calm settling over him. He'd done everything he could. The selections were complete and coded into the temporal matrix through a ritual the book described in precise detail. All that remained was to wait for 11:43 p.m. and the beginning of the end. He spent December 31st walking around Millbrook, saying goodbye to places and people who would soon exist only in his memory. The diner where he'd had lunch every Tuesday for 15 years. The park where his grandmother had taught him to feed ducks. The children playing in the snow outside the elementary school, laughing and shouting without any idea that their world was about to disappear. At 11:30 p.m., Marcus returned to the basement one final time. The book was glowing now, its pages turning themselves to reveal the final chapter, instructions for the transition keeper. As he read, Marcus felt his consciousness expanding, connecting to some vast network of possibility and potential. He could sense the other watchers from previous cycles, all of them standing with him in this moment of ultimate responsibility. 11 minutes left. At exactly 11:43 p.m. on December 31st, 2025, Marcus Thompson sat in his grandmother's basement and watched reality end. It didn't happen all at once. The first sign was that the basement walls became transparent, allowing him to see into the foundations of neighboring houses, then through the earth itself to the core of the planet spinning below. Next, the air filled with whispers. Millions of voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, all of them reciting what sounded like coordinates or mathematical formulas. Then, the people began appearing. They materialized slowly at first, like photos developing in a dark room. His grandmother, Eleanor, stood near the stairs, smiling sadly. The older version of himself leaned against the far wall, no longer aged and scarred, but restored to his current appearance. Then came others, people he'd selected for preservation, flickering into existence one by one as the reset took hold. But as the process continued, Marcus realized something was wrong. The people appearing weren't just his selections. There were others, thousands of others, filling the basement that now seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. Children he didn't remember choosing, adults whose names weren't on his list, entire families that should have been erased. "You did well," Eleanor said, moving closer. "Better than most. Your selections were thoughtful and kind." "But there are too many people," Marcus protested. "I didn't choose this many. The reset will be unstable." The older Marcus laughed, but it wasn't bitter this time. "You still don't understand, do you? The real truth about what we are, about what this family does." Marcus looked around at the growing crowd of preserved souls and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What do you mean?" Eleanor's expression was gentle but firm. "We're not the ones who choose, sweetheart. We never have been. We're just the ones who think we're choosing. The real selection happens somewhere else entirely, by something that understands the pattern far better than we ever could. But the book, the instructions, the encoding process, all real," the older Marcus interrupted. "All necessary, But not for the reasons you think. The ritual doesn't actually determine who survives the reset. It determines who remembers. Marcus felt the world spinning around him as the implications hit. You mean everyone survives? Not everyone, Eleanor said sadly, but far more than you were told. The book shows you a version of reality where you have ultimate power because that's the only way to get someone to take on the responsibility willingly. Nobody would volunteer to be the keeper if they knew the truth. Which is what exactly? The older Marcus stepped forward, and Marcus could see that his aged doppelganger's eyes now held something different than exhaustion. They held a deep, abiding compassion. The truth is that the resets aren't random disasters. They're not even resets in the way you understand them. They're updates, improvements to the base code of reality. And they happen exactly when they need to happen, guided by something far wiser than any human consciousness. Eleanor nodded. Our job isn't to choose who lives and dies. Our job is to witness the transition and carry the memory forward, to be the bridge between what was and what will be, to remember the old world clearly enough to help people understand why the new one is different. But why does it have to be us? Why does our family have to carry this burden? Because, said a new voice from the crowd, someone has to remember love. Marcus turned to see a woman he didn't recognize, middle-aged with kind eyes and wearing clothing from what looked like the 1960s. I'm Margaret Thompson Collins, your great-great-grandmother's sister. I was the keeper for the 1960 transition. More figures emerged from the crowd, each introducing themselves as members of his family from different eras, different cycles. As they spoke, Marcus began to understand the real pattern. The Watchers weren't chosen arbitrarily. They were selected because their family line carried a specific genetic marker that allowed them to perceive temporal fluctuations without losing their sanity. But more importantly, they were chosen because generation after generation had proven capable of making decisions based on love rather than fear. Every cycle, Margaret explained, reality gets a little bit kinder. Not perfect, that's impossible while free will exists, but incrementally better. Wars become shorter, plagues become less devastating, love becomes a little easier to find and harder to destroy. Marcus looked around at the infinite basement filled with souls from across all of human history and finally saw the real scope of what was happening. This wasn't an ending, it was a graduation. Humanity had passed some kind of test, reached some threshold of development that qualified them for an upgrade. So, what happens to me now? Marcus asked. Eleanor smiled and took his hand. You get to choose for real this time. You can join us as a permanent keeper, helping to guide future transitions across the universe. Or you can return to the new world and live a normal life carrying just enough memory to serve as an anchor point if humanity ever needs another reset. Marcus considered his options as reality continued to shimmer and change around him. Through the transparent walls of the basement, he could see the new world taking shape. Familiar, but improved, like a photograph that had been gently retouched to bring out its best features. If I go back, he asked, will I remember all of this? Enough, the older Marcus said. You'll remember that love is the most important choice you can make. You'll remember that time is more flexible than people think. And you'll remember that sometimes the best way to help is to simply witness and remember. Marcus looked at his grandmother one last time. Will I see you again? Eleanor's smile was radiant. Oh, honey, you'll see me everywhere. Every time you choose kindness over fear, every time you help someone else, remember that they're not alone. Every time you act from love instead of anger, that's where I'll be. Marcus closed his eyes and made his choice. When he opened them again, he was sitting at his kitchen table on the morning of January 1st, 2026. The basement door was closed, and when he opened it, he found only empty rooms filled with dusty furniture. No books, no archive, no evidence that his grandmother had ever kept anything unusual down there, but he remembered enough. As he made coffee and watched the sunrise through his kitchen window, Marcus understood that his real work was just beginning. Not as a keeper of temporal transitions, but as a guardian of small moments, everyday choices that would help ensure humanity never needed another reset. His phone buzzed with a text from Janet. Happy New Year. Looking forward to getting back to work tomorrow. The world feels different today, doesn't it? like maybe this year is going to be special. Marcus smiled as he typed back, "Yes, it is, and yes, it will be." Outside his window, children were building snowmen in the morning light, their laughter carrying on the cold air like a promise. The world looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but Marcus could feel the difference. A subtle warmth in the light, a gentleness in the way people moved through their daily routines, as if everyone had somehow forgotten how to be cruel. As he got ready for work, Marcus found a single item that had survived from his grandmother's collection, a small notebook containing what looked like recipes, but he knew better. They were instructions for small acts of kindness, formulae for hope, recipes for helping people remember how to love each other. Marcus Thompson, former keeper of temporal transitions, current guardian of ordinary miracles, put the notebook in his pocket and stepped out into the first day of humanity's next chance to get it right.